Thank you, Phoenicia. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk about this story today. It's truly an honor. Um, I'm going to go ahead and share a screen here. Um, Hopefully everybody can see that. So, my partner here, Bobby, and I will start from the beginning today and give you an overview of the piece, as well as the practical use of the platforms that have been built. A reminder is that if you like, we're using the hashtag LandGrabU to help aggregate stories, thoughts, hot takes on the subject, etc. So we encourage you to use it if you're sharing on social media. General overview here is that in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. But those institutions seldom ask who paid for their good fortune. The creation story that we're told is that these universities were given the gift of free land, but the truth is a little bit more sinister. The Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the act redistributed 10.7 million acres of land from more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. And that's an area approximately the size of Denmark. But with the footprint broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 states, the Morrill Act's place in the violent history of North America's colonization has remained comfortably inaccessible. Our data maps those 80,000 individual land parcels and provides a window into that process by revealing one set of institutions that directly benefited from violent colonization. And Bobby, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having us, and thanks to the organizers for putting this all together. It's really great to be back at Berkeley, if only virtually. What I'd like to talk about in the next few minutes is give some background on the Landgrant Universities project, provide some additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862, talk a little bit about how it worked and what our approach was, using some images from the article itself. So if you want higher resolution images that will appear in some of the next few slides, you can click on the link and go to the story itself. So the indigenous sources of university land has been a major emerging issue in the last 5 years or so. Studies of slavery in the university have provided a natural springboard for this type of work, but we could see it emerging in 2014 in Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which flags this issue. Cultural theorists like Kay Wayne Yang have discussed it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. More recently, really important articles by Sharon Stein, who provided some commentary for our article, and Margaret Nash, who's going to be talking at this conference at the second day, have framed the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settler populations across the United States. And they've really started to unpack how this legislation worked. Meanwhile, there's been a few researchers at UMass, for instance, at Virginia Tech, who are trying to map the Morrill Act footprint of individual schools and to connect them to indigenous communities, but they apparently hit some snags. Neither was complete. Some other schools, the University of Iowa, for instance, or Iowa State rather, Michigan State, the University of Nebraska, have started to map the Morrill Act parcels as well, but didn't start to look at their connections to the original owners and caretakers of the land. And more work is currently on the way. This conference owes a lot of its existence to Rosalie Fanchel, who is working on this issue in her forthcoming dissertation. There's also a team at UC who's been working on a concurrent project to understand the geographic footprint of land-grant universities. Down at MSU, there's an anthology coming out on the works of on the topic of campus, the campus and colonialism, that I think is going to push things forward. Now, all of that is to say that it's a really exciting time to be thinking about what was until recently an entirely neglected issue in the scholarship and public memory of land-grant universities in the United States. This conference on California in particular is especially timely given the governor's recent acknowledgement of the California Indian genocide of the mid-19th century and the current work happening to uncover its impact and move toward reconciliation. Now, where does the High Country News collaboration come in? Our contribution to this burgeoning field began in 2018 when Tristan and I were on fellowships back east, which was fortunate that we were came together on this. I'm a historian, he's a journalist, and we don't normally run in the same circles. Now, the project's goal was to unspool the moral act, not completely, not just to identify the parcels that benefit a single university or were located within a single state or county, but to locate them all, to find every acre insofar it was possible, and to track down the indigenous origins of each one of those parcels to gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Moral Act entailed. And to do all this in a way that put out a result that was open source, that would push the study of the indigenous origins of land-grant universities forward in a big empirical way. And the map that you're looking at here in its most condensed form is the result of our investigation. This map and the other infographics that you'll see over the next slides were all done by Margaret Pierce, their cartographer for the project. But before I get into what you're looking at here on this map, these 80,000 parcels or so, let me give you a quick sketch of some more background on the Moral Act itself. The Moral Act is known for creating a federal body of land-grant universities across the United States, but it didn't invent the idea of land-grant colleges. This comes much earlier. I was recently reading something that was suggesting that they had their origins in the United States in the 1780s. The earliest ones that I'm familiar with is in Mississippi, Jefferson College, named after Thomas Jefferson, but whose most famous graduate was Jefferson Davis. It's now defunct. But there were early land-grant universities, but the idea for what became the sort of land-grant idea of funneling land out of the public domain to expand agricultural and mechanical education, if it doesn't take root in the mid-19th century, it really takes off in the mid-19th century at the state level, with some of the universities that you see covered in this project here: Michigan State University, Pennsylvania State University. These are land-grant universities before the Moral Act. And what the Moral Act does is take what it had been a more local project and nationalizes it. The way that it's normally talked about in the literature is the land-grant universities are described as democracy's colleges, right? The idea was to expand educational opportunities for the industrial and agricultural classes of the United States. And most of the literature on the Moral Act wrestles with the extent to which land-grant universities realized that goal of democratizing education in the United States, and hasn't concerned itself with the indigenous origins of this land. The Moral Act itself comes in 1862. It's signed during the Civil War, July 2nd, 1862, by Lincoln, as Tristan described earlier, at a moment when there's a large push to convert what had been indigenous territory into various public goods and private property. So in 1862, we have what's sometimes seen as sort of the big three of the public land laws. There's the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, and the Moral Act, all passed within a few months of each other. The Moral Act is actually the smallest of the three. It gave out close to 10.8 million acres. We were able to locate roughly 99% of those, 10.78 million acres, as you see here on the slide. This was supposed to be for all states. Of course, all states that exist today did not exist in the early 1860s, so states were grandfathered in. Ultimately, 47 states got land-grant universities funded through the Moral Act of 1862 and its infrastructure. This land was sold or was leased, funneled into endowments that had to be kept intact, and the earnings could be used to fund operations of universities, with some minor exceptions. And this was resulted in what we found to be 52 universities across the United States. So there's 47 states. There's 5 states where there's 2 universities where the endowment was split. Although generally it was just to one university in a state. Most of these are public universities, University of California, University of Minnesota. There's also some private universities, Cornell, MIT. And this land, as we discovered by using geospatial analysis, comparing the location of the parcels to the location of indigenous land cessions, treaties, unratified treaties, seizures of territory by the United States, connected to roughly 250 different tribes and nations across the United States. This land was funneled into US possession legally through 162 treaties, ratified treaties, unratified treaties, land takings. And when you look at how much was paid for this land versus how much was obtained in principle by the universities for the sale of this land, roughly $400,000 was paid by the United States to extinguish indigenous title. That's in total. There are lots of places, and California is the most important one because it's true in its entirety, where nothing at all was paid. Nothing at all was paid originally for this land, and it raised in principle. So before we're talking about any earnings on the funds, roughly $23 million by the early 20th century. That is a ratio of approximately, for every $1 spent to extinguish indigenous title, $57 is dropped into the coffers of land-grant universities. In contemporary dollars, we're talking about an endowment principal worth about $500 million in 2020. And so what you're looking at on this map are those nearly 80,000 parcels that Tristan described across roughly 24 states. And what we have here is a sort of means to understand the relationships between indigenous dispossession and settler property creation through the Morrill Act. Some of the sort of pull issues that you see that Margaret Pierce pulled in this map show you, for instance, Chippewa Treaty of 1837, which contributed more than 1 million acres to 33 land-grant universities. That's more than any other indigenous land cession. It raised $3.2 million for the endowments that were raised. It cost the U.S. approximately $65,000 for the land that became part of the Morrill Act. You see here Gage County, Nebraska, which was among the most densely covered counties in the United States with land from the Morrill Act. It originally came from the Kaw Nation. Over on the left, you see in California, the highest percentage of any land cession was taken from the one highlighted here. This is the site of the Mariposa War in the early 1850s. But there were differences in how the disposal of this land worked that made it really tricky to reconstruct for the project. And the two main types was that there was land that was distributed that had to be chosen within the states, and there was something called scrip, which were sort of like coupons that were given to the states that could be used to select land anywhere on the surveyed public domain of the United States. The difference between being a land state and a scrip state was whether or not it was deemed that a Western state had enough high quality land remaining in the public domain for the state to make a adequate selection. So scrip basically goes to eastern states and some Midwestern states like Ohio and Illinois. And what they do is they sell off this scrip usually to speculators, and they take the proceeds. Then the speculators can resell it or select it all over the country. Cornell's was the largest of these grants, almost 1 million acres, because the amount of acreage that a state got was based roughly on the size of the state. pegged to the size of their congressional delegation, the number of congressional delegates they had in Congress. So Cornell gets the largest grant. It's spread out across the entire country. And then there's Western states, these land states like California, that all of the land that they select is within the state. And what you see in red here is the depth of the empirical data that we were able to amass in the process of carrying out this investigation. So you see in the California side here, I'll just mention, you see the number of parcels is over 2,300. You see, is it land or is it scrip? It's land. The total acreage, when you count it up, 150,000 plus acres. The year that it was acquired by University, you heard earlier, the University of California was founded in 1868. It's given to the University of California in the year of its founding. This is quite common. You see the number of treaties, etc., so on and so forth. When you go and you look down on the ground, we map these, almost all of them accurate to the acre. So these are parcels of the public survey, of the public domain, the sort of little squares and rectangles that you see when you fly across the country and look out the window. And here is one that Margaret and Kaylin Goodluck, our photographer, working together, were able to create this infographic. This is a square mile in Tucson. So on the left, zoomed out, in the middle, zoomed in to a satellite view where you can see sort of the row houses and the highway cutting through, and then a photograph taken by Kaylin of the Apache Tears Motel, which is located at the red dot within this parcel. So you can go from sort of 30,000 feet to all the way down on the ground. Just to show you one more slide about how it works. This is one that Margaret made that shows the progression, the sort of step-by-step of how the Morrill Act works. You probably can't read it here, but the steps that it walks through are: Congress offers the land, the states have to take it. Some of this land has been acquired from indigenous nations already. Some is going to be acquired in the future, surveyed and made available to the states for the universities. These grants are going to range in size from anywhere to 90,000 acres to 990,000 acres. That's the Cornell grant that we saw. And the parcels would be, they'd range in size from less than an acre to almost 800 acres, we found. And then there's this difference between the western and eastern states, the scrip and the scrip and the land states that you see mapped in number 4. And then the disposal process. A lot of states are selling the scrip to speculators, or western states, some of them held on to the land and they would set up real estate offices. This is what UC did, actually. And what we did in the story was try and pick out ways to describe the connections between indigenous dispossession and the funding of land-grant universities. So we tell the story of the University of Minnesota connected to Dakota land. We tell the story of Colorado State University and its link to the Sand Creek massacre. In California, we tie California's grant to the spoils of the California genocide. We look at Cornell and its speculation process, and we gesture forward to something we'll talk a little bit more about later, about land that is still held by the universities. But one of the points here, and I want to hand it over to Tristan, was that there was too much material to cover in an article. So what we did was we built an interactive site to enable users to explore the data. And I'm going to let Tristan jump into that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was to make our data available to anybody who wanted to do additional reporting or research, or to even fact check our findings. So if you're not comfortable using spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we wanted to make sure that you could still have access to this information in a clear and user-friendly way. So on landgrabu.org, you have access to the same data that we have with the same level of accuracy, and you can explore all of it through interactive maps. So for instance, we have Cornell University. You can go to university pages here, and it gives you a lot of information: founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received, but most importantly, you can play with a map that we put together. So Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site and these maps. And what it allows you to do is see the connections between the institution and the land. You can also zoom in and get really, really detailed all the way down to the acre. You can fly through or even locate yourself on the map. Those crosshairs on the right-hand side there allow the website to locate you and find out if you live next to one of these parcels or even if you live on one of them, as our developer Jeff McGee found out during the reporting process. You'll also have the opportunity to check addresses. So that search function at the bottom right-hand side of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel or even what land cession it's in. There's really a ton of information here to play with, and it allows you to explore and kind of construct your own narratives. You also have options to play with links to click on state boundaries. You'll see on the left-hand side, university links, or even Indigenous land cessions. And obviously that information on land cessions is really invaluable for a number of applications outside of this project. So much like many of the websites and services right now that allow you to see whose land you're in or trying to pull together a land acknowledgement statement, for instance, this also gives you that opportunity to do so as well. Here is a California as well. So you'll see that in this case on the page for California, UC provided a statement when we asked for comments, and you'll see that on some of the university pages as well. Again, you'll also see all of the statistics. And when we zoom out, you can see all of the connections that the university has to Morrill lands. I think that the visualization looks kind of like a fireworks explosion. Other people have said it's more like an octopus with tentacles, but I leave it up to you to decide on what that visualization looks like. The other thing you can do for each of these parcels is you can click on them and go to a page just for that parcel. So essentially what Cody and Jeff have done is create thousands of pages for each one of these land parcels so that you can get a really incredible amount of information acre by acre, state by state, and university by university. The other thing to keep in mind too is that while this works on your desktop and works really well here, it does also work on mobile. So if you want to do the kind of work that our photographer Kaylin Goodluck was doing, you can locate yourself on your phone and you can go to that actual parcel. As you can see here again, you've got adjusted for inflation as well too, in terms of what you can do with costs on this. Just again, a really incredible amount of information that's really available to basically anybody who's got a phone or a laptop. If you can see, for instance, here to get that level of detail of what Kaylin was doing, you can see two universities here with when we look at the South Carolina page. So two universities in the state benefited from the Morrill Act. And when you zoom in to a few of the parcels in Seattle, you can mouse over the parcels and there's a tab that pops up with basic information on that land, which then allows you to click on the parcel page. So here on the parcel, this particular parcel info, you can see the treaty co-signers, when it was acquired by the United States, the gains associated with it. Just with this page, you can start to construct a story about this very specific piece of land. And of course, you can go there. So that page really does exist in real life. So for instance, Kaylin went to that piece of land, and it's the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington. It has a long parcel ID, which you can match to our raw data as well, which we'll get to in just a moment. And you can see there on that page that the Indigenous caretakers were the Duwamish and Suquamish. We can see that it was ceded by treaty in January 22nd of 1855. You can see all of the sort of like metadata to this piece of land here and still be able to put a face to it, essentially. Kaylin also took a number of great photos from across the US looking at what was on the land now. These were residences just outside of Los Angeles in California. he was able to go over to Adams, Nebraska, where cornfields are now on that land. And then even to Minnesota, where we can see the scrapyard in El Rosa. And again, all of that information is available for each one of these pieces of land, if that's something that you're interested in doing, to be able to visit and really get a sense of actually what's there, how it's being used. I particularly love this photo because it creates such a clash with the idea that there were indigenous caretakers have cared for this land for so long, and now it's just a scrapyard for old cars, ceded by treaty and by force. And this data here can be used in a ton of ways. This is the raw data, and I'll turn it over to Bobby to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the way that we design the project, you can think of it in terms of different levels of curation. There is the article, which you can read in 20 or 30 minutes and get a sense of how the Morrill Act worked as a wealth transfer rather than a donation for a vast system of universities within the United States. You could spend hours exploring yourself things that we weren't able to talk about in the piece on the landgrabu.org website, looking for places that you live or work or you visited, or checking out the different statistics on different universities that we might not have talked about. But then the final sort of level that gives you the most freedom as a researcher to look at this data, to use it for yourself, to incorporate it into your own research or work, or as a teacher to build lessons around. We provide all of the data that goes into the landgrabu.org website. And this is the GitHub page where the main download is. It's all free and open to the public. If you want to go to the next slide, I'll show you there's a user guide, so you're not unmoored with a bunch of geospatial and Excel spreadsheets. It describes what every row, what every column in the database contains, and how spatial files can be joined to tabular files. The tabular files don't require any special knowledge. There are comma separated files that you can open up in Excel. There's also a spread. I think you can go to the next one. There's also a summary spreadsheet with statistics pulled out for universities and states, so a user doesn't have to necessarily crunch all the numbers out of the main spreadsheets. But what you see here is the master parcel list opened up in Excel, basically 80,000 rows of data. You can get links that will take you to the sources. You can reconstruct the various pathways, both digital and archival, through which we filtered information about parcels into this database. And there's a lot more information even here than you'll find in the landgrabu.org on the website. There's a lot more to explore here. It's broken up into just a handful of spreadsheets and just a handful of spatial files that could be easily manipulated by an intro course in GIS or something like that. Yeah, now I want to move on and just talk a little bit about something that I referenced earlier. One of the big findings from doing the investigation that really had not been noticed before is that a good amount of the land that was originally distributed under the Morrill Act is still held by universities. There are 16 universities, all of them in the West, that collectively hold more than 500,000 acres of land from the Morrill Act, and this is it's being leased. It's occasionally sold, but it's being leased. There are mineral rights associated with this land. We put out a story in August, so last month, describing this data on these 16 universities that collectively in fiscal year 2019 brought in $8.7 million in income from this remaining land. What you can really see here is that the Morrill Act, as a redistributor of indigenous wealth, isn't just a historical artifact. It's living in the settler colonial present, both in terms of actual land that's held by the universities and the continuation of holding of the endowments, the original endowments that were generated by these sales. They haven't gone anywhere. And this story, it was focused around Idaho, University of Idaho. And what we see here is the mapping of all the locations of the 33,000 acres, roughly a third of Idaho's grant, still retained by the state in trust for the university. This land was taken from the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Coeur d'Alene, and others between 1855 and 1873. Treaties that were never agreed to. In the Nez Perce case, these treaties reduced their territory by upwards of 90%. And you can really see how this is continuing into the present and has been grandfathered in to the processes through which states fund their universities in the West. Now I'll hand it back over to Tristan to talk about what some other people have been using and doing with the data.
To the point of being really an open source story and investigation, we're really, I think we're very highly opposed to the idea that one person or one team kind of jumps into an idea or an area and does the sort of the big like takeaway piece and then closes the book on that, moves on, and sort of claims that as their area of research. I think this is very common in journalism. I think it's common in a lot of other practices as well. And we really wanted to sort of subvert that by making all of that data public. And what we're beginning to see is all of the different ways that folks are integrating that into their work. So for instance, just earlier this summer, Eye on Ohio, which is an investigative news outlet covering Ohio and the region, they were able to use this data to look at lands Ohio State benefited from and start building their own maps and looking at what tribes and what tribal nations were associated with that land. Vox was able to pull together this timeline. Obviously, it looks much better on their website when you're playing with it, but it looked at the impact of the act on the Osage Nation. Which is a really great sort of way to dig down and look at just one area and its impact. We've been talking with the folks at the NICE journal. The next journal or upcoming journal has more than a dozen pieces dedicated to this research and brings a lot of really great perspectives to the story that are just incredibly important in pushing it forward and sort of recalibrating and rethinking about where we can go with this information and how the information can be used, how we can rethink what we even did in our work. There were some really valuable critiques that we got to see in those papers that are really just helpful to keep thinking about what we can do with this information. We've also seen the data being used to advocate even for free tuition for Native students and the return of land and resources. So this policy brief by Megan Redshirt Shaw for Hack the Gates went out earlier this summer as well, and uses a lot of our data and information to really make that point and advocate that for admissions officers. We have also seen at, for instance, the University of Florida, the Student Senate has introduced a resolution to establish a working group to explore the impacts of this story. We've seen the same at Cornell University as well. Just recently have started putting together the Indigenous Dispossession project to do further examination at Cornell. And obviously here at University of California now, as we're talking today. So we've seen a lot of great impact that's starting to happen, and a lot of folks that are using this information to just push in directions that we were never able to, and push in directions that continue to inform that conversation. And again, that's all with the hope that other folks will be able to do that as well, because as Bobby said, there's just so much information here that even in a lifetime, we couldn't do any of it justice. So we really hope that that open source sort of methodology is going to work in the future more.
Yeah, we just wanted to close out today by talking a little bit more about California, the subject of today, and to show you some of the unpublished work product that went into producing the Landgrant Universities story, as well as some new material pointing in possible directions for future research to understand specifically the University of California and the University of California, Berkeley's a connection to indigenous land in California. This is a map that we made for the first paragraph of the story. If you've read it, you've seen that we start with the story of Ishi, deeply connected to the University of California, Berkeley, where he was at the Anthropology Museum. There's Ishi Court, where the history department, where I studied, is. And we described the thousands of acres of Yahi land that were used to fund the University of California being sold off during the very same decades that Ishi was hiding out in river canyons east of the Sacramento River. The question was, how much Yahi land? And we used for our investigation unratified treaties in California, but that's not the only way to show the territory of the indigenous nations of California, and it's probably not even the best way. So when we were trying to figure out how do we talk about the acres sold by the University of California, we used two different conceptions of Yahi space. One from the unratified treaties, and another from an anthropological territory map, and used them as sort of a Venn diagram to see where they overlapped, to see what we could say. Ultimately, we just used thousands, but we had a debate about whether or not to be more specific. But there's so many numbers in the piece that we were looking for ways to soften that a bit. But it was analyses like this that went in to producing that information. And moving forward, I'd like to see more analyses, especially ones that look at different conceptions of indigenous space to think about the moral act footprint. We can go on to the next one. There's another line in the story that describes that at its height, the Moral Act provided more than a third of the operating expenses of the University of California. This happened in 1886, and the only way we were able to figure that out was by tracking the operating expenses for every year from the beginning that the Moral Act income provided. And what you can see here when you chart those over time, the percent of the University of California, Berkeley's operating expenses being covered by Moral Act income, you can see how this funding functioned as seed money for the university, creating sort of a wave of funding towards the beginning of the university's existence that diminishes once you get into the 20th century and as the university grows. For another view of that same information, we can go to the next slide. This is showing in dollars the operating expenses growing over the first 20 years of the university's existence, from about $7,000 in operating expenses the first year to over $200,000 20 years later, and it's just going to explode from there. What you see is the funds starting to emerge and providing a sort of cushion for the University of California to be able to get off the ground. Can we go to the next one? If you look at a longer time horizon, you can see how that income sort of flattens out, right? As the size of the university grows, as the operating expenses increase. What you see here is a 40-year period. But what some of you might be asking is, well, where was the other? Where was the rest of the income coming from? And the answer to that is that in the earlier period, it's coming from other land grants that were not the focus of our piece. So what you have is the University of California, Berkeley, in its early years, benefiting not just from the Moral Act, but from other federal grants that provide what was known as university land. There's a grant for seminary land for California that gets funneled into the University of California. There's a grant for public buildings in California that gets funneled into the University of California. And the most important one is a state grant of tidewater lands around San Francisco Bay that provides income in the early years as well. And when you add those into the mix, you get the next chart. This is, in the first 40 years, the rest of the land grant income and its relationship to the amount of operating expenses. Now, if we go back to that early period that I started with in the next slide, you can see how central they are in the first 20 years. There's a period from the mid-1870s to the mid-1880s when more than 100% of the operating expenses are being generated by land grant income. That doesn't mean all of these funds are being used for operating expenses. They can be used for capital expenses, but it gives you a sense of the extent, the importance of these funds for running these universities. And if you just go to the next one, they knew it at the time too. This is a little clip from the state constitutional convention, the California State Constitutional Convention in 1878, when they're talking about the value of these grants, and they estimate the value of the congressional grant. That's all these federal land grants as approximately $7 million. In today's dollars, that's about 181 million dollars, which is a lot, but not a lot compared, I guess, to some large universities' endowments today. But I think the really important metric is to think about how big or how small these universities were at the time and how important these funds were. So if you think about that $7 million in circa 1880 in relationship to the number of students, in 1878, there were 320 students, undergraduate and graduate at the University of California, Berkeley. So in today's dollars, that would be about $21,000 of endowment per student. The endowment of the University of California today is over $21 billion. There are nearly 300,000 students. It's about $7,000 per student. So about 3 times less than what was being estimated in the 1880s per pupil. And this is from land. So it gives you a sense of how central these land grants, not ancillary, not supplemental, they're central to the creation of institutions like the University of California. So the last slide that I had here was just to point out, I imagine a lot of the people who are watching this are from California, are in California. These are some of California's parcels at a very well-known place on Lake Tahoe, ringing Emerald Bay. It appears on a lot of calendars, things like that. There is a historic site that people go and stop at Emerald Bay. It's a place called Viking's Home. It's a sort of Nordic style mansion right on the water. You won't see any mention of this being Washoe land, this being land that was converted into the endowment of the University of California, but those stories are there too. And this project was designed to be able to pull them out.
That's the brief overview, but welcome, obviously, questions, comments. Again, hopefully, maybe this has inspired you to look at some of the additional areas of research. Again, we really want to make sure that this is available to anybody to use in any way possible, because again, there is so much information. And as Robert said, so many stories that can be found here. We look at these as at minimum 80,000 stories that can be told. And that obviously requires a lot of people to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Tristan and Bobby, for that overview. It's really such vitally important work. And there's so much, like you just said, there's so many stories and so much information there. We are going to get into some questions from the audience, but I did want to just chat with you about one thing. So the documentation of dispossession of Indigenous land to fund the education of literally millions of people in this country is both a huge undertaking and, as you mentioned, your partnership, a historian and a journalist, is a bit of an uncommon partnership. Can you just speak a little bit about why the two of you came together to work on this project, why it was important to both of you to work on this project?
Bobby, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, so the collaboration started in 2018. I had been working with the BLM land patent database for several years, mapping homestead patents, mapping the Morrill Act patents, mapping military bounty patents, and I gave a talk at Harvard where we were about the enormous challenge of completing these data sets, completing specifically the Morrill Act, the Morrill Act footprint, to try and understand the entirety of it. Because the main source that we use to reconstruct this data comes from the Bureau of Land Management, but it's deficient in several notable ways. So the main point of that talk was a pitch for help, because I thought the only way to do this in a way that could do justice to the enormity of it was through through a collectivist approach that tried to reach as many people as possible. There's a sort of emerging an emerging sort of track record for, I think, doing this type of work, historical journalism. That's coming also out of the universities and slavery work. We're seeing a lot of original publications that are digitally born, websites. We're seeing investigative reporting that's uncovering this material. So it seemed like a really good opportunity to get the word out on this material, and to try and sort of stretch the boundaries of what we think of as conventional scholarship.
And yeah, to add from my end, just being able to hear Bobby's presentation and his plea just struck me as just being a really fantastic investigative story that we could be doing. I guess from my perspective, something that may seem like that seems like a historical sort of investigation, I think, is clearly just an investigation, because there are so many ripples and so many impacts that data and information is still having on universities as well as Indigenous communities. So I guess on some level, I see that past is present, and I see that the work that Bobby was doing was just incredibly important to get out in any way possible, and being able to work together to really rethink what these partnerships can look like between journalists and academics and even historians, or whatever the discipline is. There's just a lot of area, I think, that there for collaboration in the future between disciplines, and especially in the area of investigative work like this. There are a lot of areas that I think reporters are looking at that researchers are also, and I would really like to see a lot more of those kind of collaborations in the future, because obviously we do a lot better work when we're working in a team and really sharing ideas and resources, and really thinking critically about the issues. So.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions, and I am going to do my best to get through as many as possible. Some are very specific, but there have been several questions about from the chat about what mineral rights in relation to the land grab. Was it only land on a lot of these, or most of these, or have you done the research to look at what mineral rights were retained in relation to just the physical land?
Yeah, we, as Bobby mentioned, we took a look at those remaining acreage, and mineral rights were often connected to those land grants that were given. So, for instance, North Dakota, that North Dakota's mineral rights are still producing because they were attached to the land. So obviously, sometimes the land is being sold, or the surface rights are being sold, and the mineral rights are being, the universities or the states are hanging on to them. So in terms of the data, and y'all can access this on the GitHub page as well, we do have a breakdown of all of the universities that still have those surface rights as well as those mineral acres, and whether or not they're producing. I believe University of California, for instance, still has 240 acres, I think, which wasn't producing a lot, but they 441 mineral acres remain in the University of California's control, or the states, and they produced over the last few years, not a lot, but almost $2,000. This obviously pales in comparison to, something like the Colorado State, which produced something nearly $663,000 in fiscal year 19, or North Dakota State, which was closer to $3 million.
Yeah, I would just add on the mineral rights area. Close readers of the original documents surrounding the Morrill Act will note that it excluded mineral rights. How exactly these got grandfathered in has to do. It didn't happen with script states. It happened with land states in the West. And there was I don't think we even or anyone really fully understands how it was skirted in some instances, and some it clearly has to do with the nature of the administration of the grant being with states being grandfathered in basically through their state enabling acts. But yeah, it's limited to Western states that were able to and non-script states that were able to obtain mineral rights to some of these acres.
And I'll just add, it was sort of a fluke that we figured that out. I believe we were fact checking remaining acres from a report from 1963 or 53, around that time period. And one of the natural resources officers that we were in contact with wrote back and let us know that they also still had mineral acres, which clued us in to an entirely different section of remaining Morrill Act acreage. So that it was basically just by chance that we even ran into that.
Thank you. There's several questions about the map in general. So the first one that came up early on was, this map doesn't include Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, Northern Marianas, Micronesia, American Samoa, or Alaska. Is there a reason why?
Yeah, you'll also notice that it doesn't include a land-grant university for Oklahoma, right? Even though there is Oklahoma State University as a land-grant university. We restricted the study to financial beneficiaries of the Morrill Act of 1862, or ones that were grandfathered into it through their enabling acts. So although you have land-grant universities in Guam, in Puerto Rico, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Hawaii, these land-grant universities did not receive any land grants. They received cash endowments from the United States. Most of them were created in the second half of the 20th century. Alaska has a land-grant university. It did receive land, but it's under a different law. It's the same with Oklahoma State University. So that's why you see those omissions here.
Great, thank you. There's also some questions about the methodology and resources you use to identify the boundary of Indian lands and native territories for this project.
Sorry, what was the question?
The methodologies you used to identify what was native land and who, and there's several of the questions, so I'm sort of weaving them together, but they're also curious about how you decided to represent whose territory was whose, of the indigenous peoples.
I'll let Bobby talk about the methodology on that, and I can talk a little bit about the problems as well with that too afterwards, since there are some there are some problems with I would argue, but yeah, we'll go for it.
Yeah, someone might want to drop into the chat the animation that was created at the University of Georgia on Indigenous treaties. It's done by Claudio Sant. I'm blanking on the name of it there, but basically the sources that we used were based on the Royce digital versions of the Royce maps. Charles Royce was a cartographer for the Smithsonian in the late 19th century. He undertook what was a major and turned out to be extremely important in the 20th century project to map the boundaries of Indian treaties, unratified treaties, which is in California. I see some questions about this appearing in the chat. And this is a list of about 700 Indian land cessions across the continent. And these became standard and used widely in litigation in the 20th century. So in the Indian Claims Commission, in the Court of Claims. But these are very much representations of how the United States considers its legal acquisition of this territory. That's what it's a representation of. I'll let Tristan get into some of the problems with that.
Yeah, so as I said, it's sort of legal representation, but we do know that those are obviously, the traditional idea of a political boundary or something is just, it doesn't make sense in Indigenous communities. We know that oftentimes those treaties are being signed under force or by folks that aren't representative of the tribal nations that they're signing for. Oftentimes people are not there at negotiation. Oftentimes those boundaries are based on a lot of different things that are not about traditional territory. So we are fully aware that while this gives us a data set to work with in terms of how we're going about this this work, it's not accurate to what traditional territories and ranges and living areas were. This basically gives us at least a fixed area to work with. And I think we've acknowledged this as well as in our methodologies that being able to do the kind of work where we're actually looking at tribal territories and doing this as well. We don't have the time basically to be able to do that in an accurate way. And I think it would really require a lot of consultation with basically all tribal nations to be able to figure that out. So we're aware of the limitations of the data. And we're also aware of even the limitations of some of our language as well. I see a comment here about, ceding by treaty isn't entirely valid. That's absolutely right. We tried to look and use a broad term of land cession to sort of be an umbrella term for everything from ratified treaty to an unratified treaty to even forced removal. But for the sake of being able to sort of streamline that, we needed to pick a session or a title that would really sort of umbrella that. But obviously, again, even with limitations in language, it does present problems as well.
Thank you. Yes, there are a lot of questions about the specific land that universities sit on. One of the things we wanted to uplift in this forum is specifically the UC system in California and how many of us know that California's history is a little bit different with colonization and seizure of land than some of most of the rest of the country in terms of treaties not being ratified and the amount of land that was taken across the board for different benefits for non-Indigenous people. So we kind of wanted to look at, I'm sorry, I'm trying to look for the question here now, it got gobbled up. One of the questions from a former UC student is, today's endowments are far larger than the principle of the land grabs. There are clearly other sources, and do you know what % of given university endowments come from the land grabs? Have you done that kind of research?
This would take a lot more research. Basically, we were able to create a sort of basement or a floor on which could be built, even talking about the principle. Basically, what you would want to know to answer that question is you would want to take the principle of these funds and you would want to know two things, well, three things: how much they earned, how much of that was spent on a yearly basis, and how much was churned back into the fund so it would grow over time, and what were the investment returns. I mean, this could be calculated in some cases with the Morrill Act. These were designed as income producing funds, not growth funds by law. So they would earn, for example, 5%, and they will be guaranteed that income, and they would have to spend all of it. So the principal would never change. They would only produce income. And obviously over time, this becomes infinitesimally small in terms of what it can do for the university. If you look at some, if we look back at some of those last slides, you would see it sort of very quickly, the significance of the Morrill Act income producing over time, falling as a proportion of what the operating expenses of the university are. They have their greatest importance in the sort of financial survival of these universities in the early period. But that's not to say they don't produce indirect and ongoing benefits. In the case of the University of California, one of the quotes that didn't make it into the piece was one from President Wheeler in circa 1918, 1919, where he was praising the land grants, not just for being fortunate, but for attracting other gifts, right? So they are able to grow themselves by providing stability that can be used to acquire other gifts and donations. It's an enormous sort of open problem to try to understand the long-term and contemporary impact of the Morrill Act.
And just to add to that point of Bobby saying this is sort of creating the base. I mean, you know, that the way that this project is sort of thinking about being able to provide receipts and really pull all of this information together, you know, I would argue that you can do the exact same kind of work by looking at all university lands that any university has now. This is a very sort of slim look at Morrill Act, but obviously applying that methodology to a lot of other, for instance, laws, for lands that universities are using right now. There's a lot more that can be done when you sort of like take that methodology and expand it to other areas also. Again, I think there's a lot more work that can be done in there to look at those areas and really have a deeper understanding of even what lands universities have right now.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, there's so much work to be done. We have quite a few questions that are talking about next steps, but I think we'll do one more technical question around some of the data that you have. Are these non-Morrill land grants listed somewhere on your project page? And two, when looking at the map, I find it interesting that all of the California sites emanate out from Berkeley, since that was the only UC campus in 1868. And a lot of our current campuses are not actually on land grant land. Davis, which is very old and was the university farm, is not itself a land grant land, but of course on Indigenous land, but not that it shows up on the map really. How can we connect between where the UCs are physically located and the broader land grant wealth accumulation? So one, are there non-Morrill, one is very specific, are there non-Morrill grant lands listed on your project page? And then two, how can we connect between where the UCs are physically located and the broader land grant wealth accumulation?
The answer to the first question is no. The landgrabu.org site is focused specifically on the Morrill Act of 1862. As to the second, yeah, the University of California was the original land grant university in the UC system. It was later expanded to Davis and Riverside, I believe, in the later in the 20th century. It's also true that most land grant universities are not on land that was distributed through the Morrill Act. The land was elsewhere, tens, hundreds, thousands of miles away from the campus. As for connecting other campuses to the indigenous sources of wealth that they stand on, we have a methodology for doing this already. This is the basis is the land acknowledgement is a starting point for this, asking, who are the nations that were the original owners, caretakers for the land that specific campuses were on. And you can use various resources, digital and not, of maps of Indigenous territory to understand those connections.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions about next steps, and given you both the depth that you have been working in this, both the data and then looking at different land grant institutions, do you have a sense of how you hope, I mean, I know Tristan talked a little bit about this earlier, but the hopes for how this work can be used by people advocating for truth and reconciliation or reparations or restitution, but also how folks can work within the university with this to make positive social change. There's lots of discussion about different states and land grant institutions that offer tuition waivers, et cetera. So just, can you speak to that a little bit about how you would envision, or how you have envisioned your work impacting both the academy and then the institutions at large?
I can jump in, or you can jump in, Tristan.
You can start if you like.
Okay, I'll just start by saying that where this project, I think, comes in is its ability to turn an abstract idea into a concrete one. What Tristan was talking about earlier about providing the receipts, to not just assert that the University of California benefited from Indigenous land, but to be able to say it's these acres. They were sold for this much. The money was used to do this at the university. To be able to get down and get specific about how these laws operated as resource transfers, as wealth transfers.
And I guess what I can add to it, at least in terms of next steps, is that I think just as a journalist, I'm working to, I feel like the work is there to sort of inform and educate readers in the hopes that, these institutions, or even generally those who perpetuate harm, will be held responsible in some way. And that folks will have the information to be able to make that change. I would say that would be the goal in terms of there's no one size fits all for every community or every institution, right? So having that information and allowing yourself to sort of like explore what that's going to look like, explore what that means to the communities that are impacted by this, making sure that you're having relations with those tribal nations and indigenous communities and really discussing this all the way through. I think that takes on a different form at every institution and in every community. But again, yeah, as Bobby said, having that information and being able to sort of utilize that in creative ways is what those steps forward might be. I can tell you for journalists, I really hope that it's going to be doing a lot more coverage and applying this in some very, very different ways. For instance, today we have a story out at the Texas Observer, along with other outlets across the globe. And one of the stories is looking at Texas A&M and its history as a land grad university, as well as its refusal to allow Indigenous students, staff, or faculty to be on their task force for race relations. It's given us an opportunity to be able to look at what that conversation is at the university right now, and be able to apply that information on the back end to sort of inform how this decision seems unjust in every way.
Yeah, and I can add from the university side. I mean, what we're seeing so far, and what I'd like to see, is this coming from the ground up. So you could think about it in terms of teaching. If you're at a land grant university, pitch a course that will use this information to scaffold a deep dive into the university's archives to better understand its benefits from the Morrill Act and produce a report. We're seeing suggestions ranging from changing land acknowledgements, like we saw at the beginning of this conference, to creating new scholarships at South Dakota State University. They've created a new Indigenous Students Center, opening up new faculty lines. Thinking about ways that the resources of the university can be steered to provide for the communities that have been impacted by the Morrill Act.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you so much for this work and so much for this opportunity to sort of start a conversation, because I think it was very moving for me to think about when Tristan said, there's so many stories, there's over 80 stories here. And I think it's just the very beginning of a new conversation around land grant, land grab, and how universities and institutions can start to look at what a responsibility is in a humane, a humane way, and looking at Native and Indigenous history as part of American history and not continuing to invisibilize it. So very much appreciate both of your times. We are running to the end of our time here. But I do want to say there were so many questions that we didn't have time to answer, many of them based in what we were just speaking about, which is the next steps. And I would encourage all of you who have questions around next steps to sign up for the part 2, because we will be pivoting into actually discussions of best practices and next steps, and looking at how we can move our institutions forward into something different than they are currently. So thank you, Tristan, and thank you, Bobby, so much for your time and the continued work that you're doing in this area. And for our presenters, or for our attendees, we're going to take a 5-minute break. So we will reconvene in 5 minutes at 10:32, and for our next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope folks had a chance to get a glass of water or get up and stretch. And we are happy to come back to this forum to start our next panel. And but I do want to just take a second, I know it's been done in the chat, but to thank our co-sponsors for helping put this forum on. We have the Meyer Center for Research on Native American Issues, the Rosser College of Natural Resources, Berkeley Food Institute, the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, American Cultures Engaged Scholarship Program, Native American Studies, the Center for Race and Gender here at Berkeley. Those are just a few here on campus. This was a huge effort, and we have sponsors from all three of the UC campuses that are land-grant institutions, as well as support from the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. So those three campuses are UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and UC Riverside. Okay, so that was a really lovely presentation and so engaging. And there were so many questions that I think were posed that we didn't get to, unfortunately, but also really are very relevant to part 2 of this forum, which today we wanted to unpack this history and give a chance to look for folks to understand Robert and Tristan's project. But next month, October 25th, we will be doing a more interactive and engaging part 2 of the forum that will look at what are next steps and how can we help put pressure, but also support change within the UCs to address this history. So with that, we're going to move into a panel next with 3 really lovely people. We have Dr. Beth Rose Middleton, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Native American Studies and the Yosha Dihi Endowed Chair of California Indian Studies at UC Davis. We have Brittany Arona, and Brittany is an enrolled member of the Hoopa Valley Tribe and is currently a 5th-year PhD candidate, congratulations, in Native American Studies with a designated emphasis in human rights at UC Davis. And we have Kathleen Whitley, who is currently the UC President's Postdoc Fellow at UC Berkeley. She also did her undergraduate career here at UC Berkeley. And she is incoming, she will be faculty at UC Davis next year. So welcome to the 3 of you, and I will let you get started.
Thank you. I believe I am up first, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. So, Heang Homalia Satia Nethlon, the Detuan Ante, Brittany Arona. So I'm really pleased and honored to be here today presenting on this really important topic. And I want to thank the organizers and also Bobby and Tristan for writing such an amazing article and all the work that they've been doing towards this project. I think it's really significant and important, especially here in the context of California. So I wanted to, so today I'm doing a 15-minute talk on a really, really huge historical period in California, and that's connecting the state of California history to UC land during the 1860s. And to be honest, when I was thinking about how to do this, I wanted to really contextualize California prior to the 1860s and a little bit after the 1860s, because California Indian people had already experienced a large amount of death, genocidal acts, sexual violence, and forced slavery, and prior to the 1860s through the Spanish and Mexican periods, and then into the American period in the starting in 1846. And so I want to apologize ahead of time if I miss something or, I don't elaborate on things a lot. It's a lot of history to explain within this short time period, but I'll do my best. And of course, there'll be questions after. So this is just to give you a context of the land, indigenous land in California. So on the left, we have California tribal groups and then indigenous language families. Of course, every tribal group is different. We have different traditions, different culture, different village sites. We're very unique in California because of the amount of cultural diversity that we have in this state. So my people are here up in Hoopa Valley in Humboldt County, California, Northwestern California. And then on the left, you'll see a map of the UCs. Generally, it's not like, can't specifically see it, but I'm using my cursor to show where UC Berkeley is, which is the start of the University of California system under the Morrill Act of 1862. But I really wanted to kind of give a context of where tribal lands are in relation to the university and also current university projects. So the map on the right shows natural reserves, agriculture, environmental resources, different things like that. So you can see that the contemporary impacts of the UC are still pretty strong and prevalent over indigenous land. So to go back to the very beginning of colonization in California, it's parceled out into different time periods. So there's the Spanish in 1769 and through 1821, which starts with Junipero Serra founds the Mission San Diego, the first of the 21 missions along the California coast. And the mission system was really devastating to California Indian cultures along the California coastline and inward. And the mission system really uses violence, slave labor, forced conversion to Catholicism. There's accounts of sexual violence and land dispossession. So the Spanish mission system also uses livestock, agriculture, which really changes the indigenous landscape. So we've been, you hear the term that California Indian people have been here since time immemorial, and that's true. We all have creation stories from where we're from, and we know this land better than anybody else, I would argue. And so these really strong connections between violence and land dispossession has to be made when we're talking about California Indian colonization. So then in 1821, Mexico takes control of Alta California once they gain their independence from Spain. And through this, you see the secularization, sorry, my words are mumbly, but of the mission system, and then land grants are given to settlers for the interior of California. So where I'm located at on Nisenan and Miwok lands in the Sacramento Valley, John Sutter, who's well known in this area, obtained a land grant, became a Mexican citizen, and used forced Indian labor to really take control over the land base here in the valley. So he grew hop. He was a hop farmer, did livestock, and then also sold Indian people back and forth to different landowners. And then this photo on the right is Toya Purna, and she was an indigenous Tongva woman who led a rebellion at San Gabriel Mission. And I think when we're talking about the violence towards California Indian people during these times and these really devastating times, we also have to talk about the strength and the resistance that occurred also. And it's embodied within her and many other people who are resisting these colonial forces by continuing their traditions and continuing their practices over land to great personal and physical danger to themselves. So moving into the American period, 1846, what I say to the present. So in 1846, the United States government seizes control of California from Mexico, and then it's further ratified or institutionalized through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And then in 1848, gold is discovered in Coloma, California, not too far away from here on Nisenan and Miwok lands. And it begins the California Gold Rush, which really, I'm sure many of us have learned about the California Gold Rush. And if you haven't, it was an influx of American and immigrant settlers coming into the state to acquire lands. And when you see with the California Gold Rush, you're seeing also a lot of environmental degradation. So hydraulic mining, which blows mountainsides apart and really causes damage that is present to the current day. So there's a lot of abandoned mine lands in indigenous territories. There's a lot of river systems that have been choked by these gold mining activities. So I think an important point to also note is that these violent acts in the past are very, very present today and real, and they still scar the landscape over our traditional homelands. So in 1850, as California is now a state and a part of the United States, a part of the wider United States, the first legislature of California passes the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. And while the name doesn't sound too bad, it is actually an act that facilitates removing California Indians from their traditional lands, separating at least a generation of children and adults from their families, languages, and cultures. The California law provided for apprenticing or indenturing Indian children and adults to whites, and also punish vagrant Indians by hiring them out to the highest bidder at public auction if the Indian could not provide sufficient bond or bail. So basically a form of slavery was enacted here in California through the state legislature. And the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, as he signed the law into being, he explained in his governor's speech from January 6, 1851, that a war of extermination would continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. So this is the very foundation of California at the very beginning. And that a war of extinction was to be continuously waged towards California Indian people. And with the express purpose of taking away lands, of using lands, of removing Indian people off lands. And again, so connecting these really violent events of genocide and forced removal is important when we're thinking about the land that we're on, whether that be through the UC system or anywhere that we're at, because there is a complicity that happens when we don't think about tribes when we're doing land management practices. So land dispossession is an important framework to think about California Indian history. And so even though that act was amended in 1860, it wasn't fully repealed until 1937. And so when the Morrill Act is passed in 1862, we're already at the height of violence against California Indian people within the state. So there are state-sponsored and federal-sponsored militias that go into villages and decimate populations, also high rates of sexualized violence. In 1860, there was a massacre on Indian Island for the Wiyot people in Northern California. And really during a ceremonial time. So not only just this incredible amount of violence that's happening to Native bodies and personhood, but also through cultural acts of removal and stopping our ability to go gather and participate in ceremonies and guaranteed safety. So a lot of these ceremonies went underground because of the threats of violence that were occurring towards Indian people. So a year after the Morrill Act is signed in 1862, the Nome Cult Walk of the Conca Maidu people occurs in 1863, where they are removed from their homelands near Chico, California, and placed in Covelo, California, now the Round Valley Reservation. And this was for the express removal of settlers wanting to use their lands for ranch and farming. And so 460 people made the trek, and then only 277 finished. And so I tell you this history because I don't think it's often talked about here in California, especially in the context of like K through 12th grade schooling. But it's important to understand where we come from as a state and how we can move forward towards land reclamation for tribes. So I think I'm like at 3 minutes left. So there's a lot obviously to talk about here. But so the University of California is established in 1863. Scholars of California Indian genocide will say that it ended in 1873, but I argue that it's a continuous process because of the removal from lands and our unceded status, and then also the continuous policing of our culture and our ability to interact with our traditional landscapes, whether that be through public or private lands. And so the University of California is established in Ohlone territory in 1905 as a part of the agricultural branch. University of California, Davis is established in 1905 and then becomes a full university in 1959 in Patwin territory. And then 1965, UC Irvine is established in Echiwime and Tongva territories. So every place that we think that a UC sits on now is California Indigenous lands. And I think like when we're thinking about the Morrill Act, I think we should also not only think of it as a land grab, but also of these policies within the university towards our cultural heritage. So there was actually a really great question about the connection between NAGPRA and the holdings that universities have of our ancestors, our items of cultural patrimony, our funerary, non-funerary objects. And I think there's absolutely connection between those things that were removed from us without our consent, our ancestors that were removed from us without our consent, and those holdings that still exist within the UC system. And I know that there are laws that have been passed to help alleviate that. But I think until our ancestors are returned home, like we have to keep fighting for the repatriation of them back. And the establishment, passing of the Morrill Act really helped to heighten this collecting legacy that the University of California has. When Tristan and Bobby introduced their article with the story of Ishi, I think that really hits on all these points of land dispossession and violence, and then his removal to the University of California system to be treated as a museum exhibition, and then his brain being removed and being sent to the Smithsonian and then having to be repatriated back decades later. So it really speaks to this treatment that California Indian people are still given within the context of the University of California system, and then many other land institutions as well. I think I'm at time, but I just wanted to give a brief overview. Again, it's not as in-depth as I think a topic like this should be. You could teach a whole class about California Indian history and really probably not even scratch the surface of our really rich and important culture. But I also want to point out that California Indian people are really leading these efforts, like leading land reclamation efforts. So I mentioned the story of Indian Island up in Wiyot territory, and that they were able to get that land returned back to them, Tuluwat, because of their advocacy for decades. Like it was a decades-long fight to get their sacred spot back, and they did it. And I think we really need to give credit towards here in California Indian people who are leading those efforts and continue to lead the efforts towards repatriation and land reclamation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brittany. And I wish we had more time for everybody because these are huge topics and they deserve more than just a few minutes. Next, we have Kathleen Whitley, excuse me.
Hi, thank you, Brittany. I will share my screen. Hopefully, everyone can see that. Is it full screen?
So,
Oh,
yeah.
is it? Can you? Oh, it's not. Okay.
No, it was perfect. You
Oh,
were good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Cool. Okay. Sorry to clarify, you can't see what's everything else on my screen.
Oh, we can't see the full screen, so you just have to do play from start.
Okay. Hello, hi, my name is Kathleen Whiteley. I'm a postdoc at Berkeley. In 1905, reformer Charles E. Kelsey and the missionary organization called the Northern California Indian Association, the NCIA, revealed to the public not one, but two secrets about the state's past. That year, Kelsey and the NCIA publicized the fact that California's indigenous peoples had signed no less than 18 treaties with the federal government in the 19th century, none of which had been ratified by the United States Senate. Moreover, not only had this raft of legal agreements been ignored by the Senate, but the reformers emphasized that the federal government had further insisted that an injunction of secrecy be placed upon their very existence. They literally wrapped the 18 treaties in red tape. This news of the secrecy of the rejected treaties of California captured public attention. Larissa K. Miller, in her groundbreaking 2013 article on the secret treaties with California Indians, documented how the Lost Treaties publicity campaign by Charles Kelsey and the Northern California Indian Association was able to create real change through land return. In a context of entrenched legal and cultural injustice, Native Californians developed skillfully effective political strategies of survival, including the recruitment of the public press to help them. The unearthing of the unratified treaties helped to shape a radical departure in the history of California Indian country. Today, I'm here to talk briefly about the history of these 18 unratified lost treaties of California and their lasting legacy with California land rights. Made with various tribal communities, these 18 treaties promised about 7.5% of the total acreage of California. The California legislature, by resolution, urged Congress not to ratify the 18 treaties for the state. Governor Peter Burnett reasoned that the land reserved for the use of Indians was worth not less than $100 million. Certainly a far cry from the 5 million California Indians eventually won through a lawsuit 100 years later. This exception to the typical pattern of treaty making in the 19th century has had a powerful role in shaping Indigenous peoples' relationship with the federal government ever since. During the last half of the 19th century, as Brittany just discussed, California Indians were subjected to persecution, abuse, and discrimination to an extent unequaled in other states where the treaty-making policy of the government had resulted in the establishment of these reservations. Following statehood in 1850, California passed a law for the government and protection of Indians, which not only legally sanctioned indentured servitude and slavery of Native Californians, but also that Indian persons could not testify or represent themselves in court. After the 18 treaties were rejected by the Senate, some military reservations were established, but many tribal nations were forcibly removed from their lands. The existence of these treaties was not a secret, as tribal groups whose ancestors signed the treaties did not forget about them. The work of the treaty commissioners was widely reported in newspapers. Some of the anti-treaty newspaper articles and their motivations are further examined by Brendan Lindsay in his 2012 monograph, Murder State, California's Native American Genocide, 1846 to 1873. Lindsay argued that Americans wanted to engage democracy to bring about their collective will to eliminate Native Americans as obstacles to landholding and general conceptions of wealth and security. Lindsay explored how notions of democracy, ultra-individualism, and the pioneer spirit orchestrated mass murder in California. The federal government was also well aware of these treaties in California. In 1899, Charles Royce published 67 maps of Native American land cessions with 2 maps for California. The first map of California outlined the lands promised under the 18 treaties. As Tristan and Bobby talked about, if you see in their map, they're using the Royce map to talk about the treaty lands promised. And there are problems with the Royce maps. Of course, he did not visit California. And I think with different tribal nations going through treaties and seeing what lands were promised or not could yield maybe a certain, some differences in the maps. The history of the federal-Indian relationship in California is different in many aspects than that of Native peoples elsewhere in the United States. While Indigenous peoples of California negotiated these 18 treaties of friendship and peace between 1851 and 1852, they were never ratified. President Millard Fillmore appointed 3 federal agents to make these treaties: George W. Barber, Reddick McKee, and O.M. Wozencraft. Not one of the agents had any experience working with Native peoples or treaty making. McKee was a merchant in Virginia, an acquaintance of Alexander Stewart, the Secretary of the Interior. Barber was a former government official from Kentucky, and Wozencraft was a physician who had migrated from Louisiana to California during the gold rush. Indeed, he was actually the only one who had ever visited California before. None had any obvious qualifications for the task, apart from the one that really mattered. Each was active in his state's Whig Party, the party of President Millard Fillmore. Their orders were to secure Indian land title in California. Barber arranged 4 treaties, Wozencraft arranged 8, and McKee 4. The first and second treaties were negotiated by the commissioners acting together as a board. But because of the urgency of the matter, the difficulties of treating with such diverse peoples over a giant area, and the slowness involved in traveling to these places, the 3 men decided to draw straws and decide where each one would go. McKee's going to the north. We have Barber kind of central, with Wozencraft in the south. The commissioners moved through the state with the military in tow. They made camps. They would send out word through a variety of means that they were a treaty-making party. And they visited different tribal groups and villages and invited them to attend these treaty-making sessions. Some tribal groups obviously were suspicious and refused to attend because of fears of retribution from settlers or the military who were claiming their indigenous lands. While the treaties differ somewhat in their wording, they're all essentially the same. They define areas to be set apart and forever held for the sole use and occupancy of that tribe of Indians. I should say, when we think of the tribes as defined through these treaties, it can be a little confusing because of the tribal designation. Sometimes were more so villages that they were making these treaties with. This is a map from the California Indian History website that I encourage everyone to click on and look, and based on wherever you're at right now, you can see what treaty would be closest to you. So the colors based on whoever was making the treaty. And the numbers, these letters are sometimes referred to the California treaties, and that's just the US Department of Interior letter designation. So sometimes you see like Treaty K, for example, and what does that mean? Of course, these names were not indigenous names. You know, these are names given by the treaty commissioners. So treaty made at Camp Union, for example, or treaty made at Bidwell's Ranch. Some treaties were signed by Native Californians who had Spanish given names, and so usually maybe in the southern part of California, and a number of treaties were signed by indigenous peoples who did not have Spanish or English names, we see with X's. For most part, these people didn't know Spanish or English. California Indian language advocates who today are at the forefront of revitalizing languages across the state showcase the sheer scope of linguistic diversity of California. So these records of the treaty commissioners, translators, and secretaries are all available online to read for the most part. If you some are paywalled. If you want more discussion, like Robert Heiser's discussion of of George Gibbs's journal. George Gibbs was a secretary for Reddick McKee. So I encourage you to check that one out if you're from Northern California. It discusses, for example, going up to the Eureka area with Wiyot people and meeting Wiyot people, but not having a translator to speak with them, talking about the kind of devastation of disease and already massive violence happening against Wiyot people. And this is 10 years before what Brittany mentioned was the Tuluwat massacre of Wiyot people. I'm a descendant of Nancy Spears, who was one of the survivors of the Tuluwat massacre, and her youngest daughter, Flora. So to think that these treaties could have played some part in stopping some of these massacres across California, I think is very important. The California senators did everything in their power to defeat the ratification of the treaties. On July 8th, 1852, the Senate unanimously voted to reject the treaties. The substance of these treaties was not made public and a ban of secrecy was put upon them. There appears to be no surviving account of the debate, if there was a debate, for the failure of ratification. Once the treaties had been rejected, new treaties were ever made. In the summer of 1852, the Senate also rejected a group of land cession treaties with tribal nations in Oregon. However, these were renegotiated and ratified a few years later. Instead, the position of the Indians of California grew more precarious, with genocidal consequences, as we just heard. In 1871, Congress put a formal end to the institution of treaty making. The abolition of an Indian treaty weakened any pressure that might otherwise have existed to renegotiate land cessions with California Indians. Anthropologist Robert Heiser famously wrote about the treaties. Taken all together, one cannot imagine a more poorly conceived, more inaccurate, less informed, and less democratic process in the making of the 18 treaties in 1851 to 1852. In conclusion, the 18 unratified treaties were broken, not lost. The rhetoric of California's lost treaties offered traction for social reformers and community organizers with which to pressure the federal government to begin to make significant change in its policy toward the state's many indigenous groups. It worked. Between 1905 and 1930, the social and economic conditions among the indigenous peoples in California changed as 59 settlements known as rancherias were purchased by the federal government for landless communities of Native Californians. Held in trust by the federal government, these rancherias were land bases with which modern California indigenous communities lived collectively and received federal appropriations, sometimes for the first time. The rediscovery of the lost treaties not only prompted a wave of Native organizing, but also stirred unprecedented public support in matters which directly concerned Native California political and legal standing. Native Californians and their supporters began a better drive for land, better education, the rights of citizenship, and legislation for the settlement of the unfulfilled treaty conditions. These land settlements were the subject of my dissertation, and I would be happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Indeed, California Indians were paid for some of the lands promised to them in treaties or outright stolen in genocide. In 1972, the Indians of California were awarded a settlement from the Indian Claims Commission for $29.1 million, representing a payment of a mere 47 cents per acre. The Indian Claims Commission was established to finally render justice in ongoing land and treaty disputes with Indian nations. But was 47 cents an acre for the land of California all this justice was worth? Further, this monetary payment for stolen lands does not include the lands bestowed on California's land grant system. At 47 cents per acre, the settlement reveals the Indian Claims Commission didn't work in the way it was intended. It didn't quash the land claims of the Indians of California. The 1905 discovery of the lost treaties inspired remorse, but never forced those to accept the finality of a state and culture conceived in genocide. Regardless of the determinations of these land claims proceedings, quest for land's restoration and access will continue on the need to protect cultural places and practices tied to those places. However, these cases and the actions of Native Californians to advance them mark their continued strength, resiliency, wit, and vitality over time. Thank you. This is another slide.
Thank you so much, Kat. I really appreciate that. And you did a great job. To sort of round out this historical overview, we have Beth Rose Middleton, who will be presenting next.
Thank you, Fenosha, and thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to be here with you all and to follow those very powerful speakers and to just be part of this panel talking about this really important research. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I see my role today is to talk a little bit about what can we do with this information, opportunities to address UC's land grant context and to draw on two popular hashtags, although I barely know how to use Twitter myself, land grab U to land back. So how do we move from being land grab to being part of this greater movement of land return, land restitution towards justice? And the picture in the background here is from the ceremony recognizing the transfer of lands within the Maidu homeland, Mount Maidu, to the Maidu Summit from Pacific Gas and Electric. So just as a backdrop as we think about land restitution. So I'll give a little context about some of University of California's lands, and then briefly touch on some different opportunities: land transfers, easements, co-management, investments in tribal collaboration, and investments in Native student support to think about ways forward. So, of course, as Brittany shared in one of her maps, UC land ownership goes far beyond campuses. We have natural reserves throughout the state, about 750,000 acres, and it's explicitly recognized in this accountability report from 2020 that we are one of 4 trustee agencies recognized under the California Environmental Quality Act. UC holds reserve natural resources in trust for the people of the state. So I'm going to return to that at the end. What is this holding land in trust for the people of the state, working for the public trust? What does that mean? UC also has agricultural experiment stations, experimental forests, and research stations throughout the state. This is a map from the UC Natural Reserves website showing the different reserves throughout California and the different campuses that administer them. This is a map created by one of my advisees who just graduated with a PhD in ecology, Chris Adlam, showing the UC reserves and field stations and California Indian tribal territories broadly construed. This is a preliminary list of the reserves and traditional territories. It's very preliminary. We're still working on this. So this system of UC lands is growing. It's not necessarily a static system at all. New reserves have been added at Lassen or Comyumani in the Mountain Maidu and Pit River homeland, Point Reyes in collaboration with national parks. Tejon Ranch has been under consideration as a natural reserve that's down south and has a very intense history in terms of it was basically a concentration camp for Indigenous people in that region prior to its life as a conservation area. And there have been recently addition of more forest lands via the Pacific Watershed and Land Stewardship Council process, or PG&E's land divestiture. UC land management, just briefly, what happens on these lands? Research and education to expand knowledge on California ecosystems and developing best practices. And I put that in quotes because the view on what a best practice is for natural resource stewardship can vary culturally. For a best practice from a Western science point of view might be very different from a best practice from an Indigenous California specific tribe point of view. So we look at research and education on ecosystems and then developing land management strategies in the context of a changing climate. But along with others in this forum, I ask on whose backs? How did this land become UC land? Who did it come from? And did those who it was taken from receive any benefit? And as we know from the previous presentations, Native nations in California receive little to no benefit from these land seizures, and many continue to have no land today. And I return to something my mentor and friend, Farrell Cunningham, wrote in one of the first land management plans by the Maidu Summit for Tasman Koyam, where he talks about, with these lands, we have an opportunity to address a great wrong. And it is scary. We may be frightened of outcomes we are unsure of, but we should be even more frightened of living in a world where the foundation of injustice is honorable and the perpetuation of that injustice acceptable. So I think this is where we are in terms of a point of reckoning, looking at this history and then thinking, what do we do about it? So here are some opportunities. Land transfer. There is recent precedent for land return to tribes by churches. There's a couple examples from 2019 in Ohio and in New York, by cities, as Brittany mentioned, the city of Eureka returning land to the Wiyot tribe, as Kat also indicated. Conservation transfers are many. There are recent transfers of land to tribes, typically with conservation covenants by Trust for Public Land, Western Rivers Conservancy, local land trusts, and other entities. And then I found a federal example, a recent example of the Western Oregon Tribal Fairness Act, which transferred Bureau of Land Management land to tribes. I did not find university examples of transfer to tribes, but that said, I haven't really delved into research in this area. I think it's important, and I think UC might consider being precedent setting in this regard. Other opportunities, financial transfer. This is an example of an individual who is a retired CSU professor who looked into the benefit her family received financially from having this Ute land, and then calculated how much it was worth and wrote a check to the tribe. So that's another opportunity to consider. Another is easements. According to UC easement guidelines, University of California can hold property with conservation easements on it, or grant easements on its property for mitigation or other purposes. So some possible scenarios are UC granting easements to tribes, tribal organizations to enable, facilitate, support the carrying out of certain rights and responsibilities on land that's under UC jurisdiction but is within tribes' homelands. Or UC could transfer land to a tribe, a tribal organization, and retain an easement for UC activities, which could include research, restoration, et cetera, on that land. So another tool in the toolbox. Investing in Native students. This is an example from South Dakota State University. They have this powerful initiative. They are looking explicitly as land at revenue from land that was claimed from Indigenous peoples, taken from Indigenous peoples. They're looking at that revenue and investing it in Native student support. And there are other examples of this as well. Tuition waivers for Native students. I saw Professor Mishana Goman from UCLA commented on this in the comment. The UC tuition waiver proposal for California Indian students, I've heard this discussed many times, really fully support it. I don't know if it is moving forward at the system-wide level. There is quite a bit of precedent for tuition waivers for Native students throughout the US. Again, not an exhaustive list. These are just a few of the colleges and universities that have tuition waivers. A few opportunities for research and education, just thinking about these lands, maybe natural reserves, maybe other lands. Are there opportunities for hands-on land-based education that both recognize and compensate Indigenous expertise? Are there opportunities for internships and scholarships for students from Native nations and communities to do research and other work on UC lands? Can we find ways through UC to support land-based education for tribal schools and youth groups in collaboration with Native University of California student groups, faculty, staff, and departments? And these are some images from our Keepers of the Flame course at UC Davis, being out with Ron Good in the top photo, with Diane Almendarez and Ardith Reed at the Tending and Gathering Garden in the middle photo, and the bottom photo. And I really, again, want to recognize some of the amazing partners, including graduate students in Native American Studies, such as Melinda Adams, and in ecology, such as Chris Adlam and Denise Martinez, who have been central to making this course happen. More opportunities building collaboration. Are there opportunities to develop tribal engagement strategies very specifically for UC lands, both specific to parcels and broad across the system of different types of lands that UC owns? We do have precedent for this at the state level per Executive Order B1011 by former Governor Brown, requiring tribal consultation in state agencies with tribes. What about developing agreements or memorandums of understanding to establish access and stewardship by Native nations on homelands that are currently under University of California jurisdiction? What about establishing, if people would like to, Indigenous advisory committees to cooperatively steward certain lands under UC jurisdiction, and supporting these committees, not expecting people to give freely of their time, but providing financial and other support. I mentioned conservation easements before. That has been an area of my work, and I think they can be powerful in terms of asserting a stake in property ownership and jurisdiction. They can be a tool that's used by tribes in different ways, or tribal organizations. And then transferring ownership of land. And this transfer could include research or access for UC. People have talked about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. I wanted to briefly mention UC's repatriation context. As Brittany was mentioning, lands and ancestors were seized, and the impacts reverberate well into the present. Just a few months ago, UC issued the revised Native American Cultural Affiliation and Repatriation Interim Policy, stating a commitment to repatriation of ancestors. What about rematriation of lands? Thinking about ancestors and lands together. And also an element of the repatriation policy is consultation and consent What about consultation and consent regarding research within Indigenous homelands? How would we monitor and evaluate some of this work? Questions we might ask, and I want to again recognize Chris Adlam, recent PhD in ecology, who helped develop some of this work. But are there MOUs or agreements or consent that is being acquired for research, classes, management that involve cultural resources and homelands? Have these MOUs been signed? With whom? Pertaining to what activities? Are there models that can be used on other lands within the UC system? Maybe we consider annual reporting on tribal engagement, tribal collaboration, going beyond engagement on UC lands. And here are some of the questions that faculty might be asked. Does your work involve tribal cultural resources, not limited to archaeology, land and homelands, waters? Are you in consultation or communication with tribes whose homelands you are working within? What steps are you taking to ensure that your research is not only respectful and culturally sensitive, but responsive to tribes' management goals, stewardship goals, land access, land reacquisition goals? What steps are you considering to involve the tribe or tribal individuals in work within tribal homelands? So these are just some questions that might be asked, things we might consider as we look at monitoring moving forward on this work. So to summarize here, some of the challenges / opportunities are that we're in this moment, a challenging moment of acknowledging the historical and contemporary impacts of on Native nations in California, of the land grab history of University of California. For some people, they've never stopped acknowledging and being aware of this history, but for some of it is newer. So what do we do with this really heavy information? How do we invest in creating and building new partnerships for co-management, collaboration, partnership, stewardship, and research with consent? And this doesn't mean that University of California does not continue to foreground research and education. That is our mission, but can it be done in a way that does not further injustices? And how do we shift funding and emphasis to expand programs to address, rectify institutionalized impacts of this land grab history? So I'll close with just noting that UC, University of California, has a public service mission. We hold land in trust for the people of California. We produce public accountability reports. And so to me, part of this focus and inquiry and understanding this land grab history and acting on it is about explicitly acknowledging what limitations in the past have been placed in terms of what public means and who counts as part of the public, and taking specific steps to rectify the impacts of the establishment of UC and really build on our strengths to improve our work going forward. And some of the tools we can use are easements, co-management agreements, returning property or the revenue from property, and then building strong and effective and positive education and research collaborations. So thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute this morning.
Thank you so much, Beth Rose. That was a lot of information delivered very eloquently, so appreciate you. We have a few minutes for questions for this panel. And there are a couple of questions that are aspirational, but I did want to give Brittany or any of you the opportunity. She pointed out a question that was asked in the first half of the segment that we didn't get a chance to get to, but I think that it's also relevant for both of you, not both of you, all three of you, is the question was, given the UC's horrible NAGPRA legacy, do you see a connection between settler projects to dispossess tribal lands with the dispossession by universities of our deceased relatives and cultural objects via anthropology and archaeology? And I know you talked a little bit about it, Brittany, but I wondered if any of the three of you wanted to expand on
that. Yeah, I can expand on it a little bit. So yeah, I think there is a definite connection, as I mentioned in my talk, between, the dispossession of lands through the Morrill Act of 1862 and then the establishment of the University of California system in 1868, and this project of archaeology, anthropology, removing our ancestors, our cultural items, our, funerary, non-funerary objects from our homelands and placing them into collection centers. And I know that Beth Rose touched on the repatriation policy that is going through UC Davis right now, and also going through the wider UC system towards strengthening repatriation of what is still in UC collections back to tribes. And so there's a lot of really great books that reflect on the legacy of California Indian anthropology towards California Indian people. I'm thinking mainly of Tony Platt's Grave Matters, that goes into this kind of devastating history of both anthropologists like Alfred Kroeber and his cadre of archaeologists and anthropologists who went out across the state to do a wide amount of collecting. And then the legacy of, say, amateur archaeologists or amateur people who would go out and collect things off of public and private lands as well. And so that book focuses mainly on Stone Lagoon in Yurok territory up in Northern California, but it really gives a kind of nice overview of this really terrible, frankly, history of removal of our cultural items and our ancestors that are still housed in not just UC collection centers, but other collection centers in the state as well, and across the nation, like at the National Museum of the American Indian, or in Europe at like the British Museum. So there's like this there is like this very strong connection between the California Indian genocide, the dispossession of lands, and then the removal of our cultural and ancestral, our ancestors from land. And it all ties back to those really complex things that occurred in the early making of the state that continued to the present day.
Thank you. We have sort of a follow-up question that came through with that, and this again is not just directed at Brittany, but I think Kat and Beth Rose also have could respond to this as well. But how do we emphasize the need to connect NAGPRA to NAGPRA repatriation to the return of native land and to native communities, since few have the land in which to return ancestors to?
I can answer that too a little bit. You know, I think that that's true, that there are many tribal lands in California where people don't have the adequate land base to actually repatriate and bury their ancestors back on their homelands. But examples that I've seen that have worked out really well have been tribes with larger land bases, maybe allowing tribes that don't have it to rebury on their lands. Also, I've seen good collaboration between institutions that do have land holdings. So say if the UC, like the natural reserves or the lands that the UCs have, would be amenable to allowing tribes to rebury their ancestors on what is UC property now. And I think that tends to work out well. And I know that state parks has a policy of allowing that kind of stuff to happen too, and then national parks. It's unfortunate that, you know, we have to ask for permission for these kinds of things to be able to both repatriate and to rebury on public and private lands. But there are intersections and ways to do that that have been successful that I've seen.
Thank you. Let's see. There's another question that came in, and Beth Rose, this might be one that you begin with, but of course, Brittany and Kat, feel free to jump in. UC Davis has a lot of research land. How do interested faculty learn which Indigenous peoples and how to contact them, and then contact them regarding consultation on research they're carrying out in these lands?
So there's probably a few ways. One, that slide I showed with the preliminary list of Indigenous homelands and natural reserves, that's just a beginning of, I think, what we hope will be a much larger effort to add additional nations, add contact information so that people can begin to reach out. I also want to point out that there's a Native American and Indigenous Advisory Committee that's recently been formed at UC Davis. And so, this may be something that advisory committee might engage with as well. But this is something we're working on.
Thank you. So I have another question that, again, I think is for all, could be for all of you, but I'm gonna ask Kat if she has some perspective on this. You see, as a Native California woman who is working within, both you and Brittany, working within a system that was not created for Native California tribal members, and then specifically Native women who identify that way. I think it speaks to this moment of change that we are in, or this possibility, opportunity of change. And so it's broad, but I'm curious what you think. UC has the world's largest university-owned natural reserves in California, a total of 756,000 acres, which is bigger than total Indian reservations and rancherias, which is 520,000 acres in California. I'm not fact checking that, this is what the person said, but the reserves often reuse the access rights of local indigenous communities. The reserves only apply Western Fortress conservation, excluding human interactions or TEK practices by local traditional indigenous communities. The lack of traditional environmental knowledge practices, the reserves become vulnerable for mega fires and losing biodiversity. Super environmental racism is going on here. How can we change? And I think that I'm asking that to Kat as sort of a larger question of how do we see the university changing, as somebody who is working within the university, but also one of those people making change. As Brittany mentioned, it's the California natives at this point who are really making change, as even though it's not very visible.
I think there's so many changes going on right now, and I think it's a really exciting time. I think in terms of the environmental science aspects, I will defer to Beth Rose and what's happening. But I would say that I think, and going forward in the future, that because of so many different things that are happening, the UC system is going to have to respond to what's happening. There's a lot of, rah, we're a land-grant institution rhetoric, and what does that mean for Indigenous Californians? Further settler colonial erasure further happening. But yes, I would turn to Beth Rose with the environmental question.
So regarding the reserves, I saw that question. It's an important question. I mean, the reserve system is large and diverse. Something I have just begun working on with a few students is beginning some outreach to the natural reserves managers, developing a survey to see, whether or not they have been collaborating, what type of collaboration, if they're interested in building collaborations, if they're aware of whose homelands they're working within, et cetera. So there's, I would say, a beginning effort there. And I'm not denying what is said in the question. I would just say that there's a lot more information that I think needs to be gathered about what's happening on the different reserves throughout the system. So far, I have heard openness to, beginning conversations about collaboration. And I hope we can really move that forward, from a system-wide level.
Thank you. I think this question is to both Brittany and Kat. In your work, I mean, I think it's very relevant that you are both doing work on history of California in an effort to visibilize a relatively invisibilized piece of this country's history and the state's history, and with Gavin Newsom issuing an apology to Native California tribes for a genocide, which was historic in that it was the first time an official had called it a genocide. And we're talking about these moments of opportunity. How do you see your work carrying some of that opportunity forward? And what do you hope to see shift in your time and with your scholarship? Start with maybe Kat first.
So my research primarily focuses on California Indian history in the 20th century, and I think that's such an important part of California Indian history. Sometimes when we think of California Indians are relegated to maybe some past time periods, stopping at American genocide, but then maybe skipping ahead, this big gap that happens, and then you have gaming, and somehow there's this big disconnect of what's happening throughout the 20th century. So that's what my dissertation tried to look at in my now book project of these two different land claims cases that happened. And obviously disappointing results for Indigenous peoples in terms of financial award, as well as recognition of some of the land bases. But I think there's so much history that of Native peoples in California that doesn't start in the 1960s with Red Power. It starts at the turn of the 20th century with Native-led California activism to seek return of land through rancherias or through these different legal cases that will happen. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I had to try to unmute myself. So my work mainly focuses on both the connections between genocide and land dispossession, which I've talked about a lot here, but also environmental injustice on the North Coast, Northern California, northern part of California where I'm from, where the Hupa, Yurok, Karuk, Wiyot, Tolowa peoples are, and others that I'm not naming are at, and really fighting towards water justice. And this has been a decade, water justice and land justice. So this has been a decades generational fight that has, you know, consumed both my great grandparents' generations and then mine as well. And so I really see, like, with the apology, you know, this ability to push corporations that are impacting like water systems towards a more equitable environment for Indigenous people in California, if that makes sense. Because on the Klamath River and across the state in different areas as well, I'm thinking of both like the Owens Valley Paiute, who in their long fight with the Los Angeles water district down there, Water and Power District, and other people I'm not naming too, that I hope that my scholarship at least brings some light into the Native-led grassroots advocacy that makes these changes happen. Like it really isn't like, it really is the Native voices that are saying that we need these things to occur in the state for us to have both our lands back and the ability to live on our lands in a way that is without environmental violence. So the river on the Klamath River is still choked up from, you know, these dams still being on there. And it has state support, it has Oregon state support, it has recreational support, but it's kind of being held there by Pacificor right now, which is a Warren Buffett company, a corporation. And so, and it's, my main point is that we have to look towards the advocacy that Indigenous people are doing right now for their lands. And I'm thinking too of the Kumeyaay people who are protesting the border wall right now and putting themselves at risk to protect their homelands. So yeah, I mean, I hope that makes sense, but I'm really hoping that, you know, the work that I do both academically and then through like my volunteer organizational stuff on the Klamath River shed some light onto the need towards land reclamation and land back for us.
Thank you. We have a question for Beth Rose. You mentioned the primary purpose of the UC is to educate, but is that focus achievable without acknowledging the land grab and displacement of Indigenous people?
That's a great question. And no, I don't think so. That's why I think this is so essential for us to come face to face with this history. You know, I wanted to acknowledge too that, you know, for some people, this history has always been present, but then for many of, you know, the UC faculty or maybe administration, this might be newer information. So I'm really grateful to Tristan and Robert for putting all of this information together and for the way people are using it to draw attention to the profit from native land, particularly in California, that supported all these land-grant universities. So we really need to look carefully at that education, research, and service mission. How can we complete that, without being attentive to this history and responding to it and working to rectify, the way the whole system is set up. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Bestos. This one is, again, I think a question that could be addressed by all three of you, but I'll start with you, Beth Rose. What successes and challenges have you seen in building accountability to California Indians amongst scholars outside of those directly doing work with Native American and Indigenous studies? For instance, if someone is studying traditional ecological knowledge in ecology, they may be more willing to participate in efforts versus a wider ecology or conservation biology program.
That's a good question. I was going to start right away with Native American Studies, American Indian Studies programs, in terms of really being founded on doing collaborative work that speaks to interests and needs among Native nations. But the question points to people outside of NAS and AIS. I think there are some examples of ethnoecology work that has been done that recognizes Indigenous knowledge and the importance of Indigenous stewardship. I might point to Kat Anderson's work. I think foregrounding Native knowledge in a way that perhaps other ecologists had not done prior to her work. Let's see, other examples. I think in education, there have been some good examples of developing collaborations that are really focused on, community, like work in community, work with students, work in schools, improving curriculum, the whole, I forget the name of it, but there's a whole collaboration to reform the fourth grade curriculum. I think that's been in collaboration with representatives of different Native nations. I feel like that is a positive example for much needed change for how students are taught about California Indian history from a young age. So those are two that come to mind right away.
Thank you. Kat or Brittany, did you have anything you wanted to add in your perspective and working with tribes outside of Native American studies?
Do you want to go, Kat, or you want me to go? So I'm trying to find the question again, sorry.
The question.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, that's fine. It says, I lost the question. I highlighted the wrong one. It had to do with what were best practices or what were effective measures of having faculty work with tribes outside of Native American studies. So in departments such as, there might be somebody in environmental sciences that is working with traditional ecological knowledges that might be open to working with tribes versus somebody in Native American studies. So moving it outside of Native American studies and encouraging other departments and faculty to be involved with tribes.
Okay, yeah. I something that I always say to people in my, a different work capacity is that anything that you do has to do with Indigenous people broadly because of the land that you're on and where you're at. So if you're doing environmental studies here in California or in the somewhere in the Americas or in other places like New Zealand and Australia, you're interacting with Indigenous people based on the land that you're working on. And I think that has to be, in my opinion, it has to be at the forefront of an environmental scientist as they're working on Indigenous land. Like, how am I interacting with this space that probably has a history of violence? I think that sometimes, I'm an environmental humanities person, so I tend to think about the environment in both the scientific way and then in the humanities, that you can't really separate those two because of our relationship with land itself. And so I guess my recommendation would be, if you do want to work with the tribe and you're an environmental studies person or you're a historian or anything, really come with a sense of humility that the tribes that you're working with are going to have the most knowledge about their lands, probably more than you, because of the long history that we have on engaging with our lands. And I can think of like a really great program that I worked with is Shingle Springs. They have a great traditional ecological knowledge program and department. And they really, I mean, I learned so much from them when I interact with them. And it really, I think you really do have to come with a sense of humility and you know, being able to collaborate with the tribe, and not coming at them with like, this is my expertise. It's like, well, what expertise can I learn from you?
Thank you.
I would also say it's a really exciting time with all the different California Indian scholarship that's coming out by a lot of California Indian peoples. It's touching all facets of society. From the environment, we have history, anthropology, Native literature, of course, philosophy. I think there's just so many facets and resources out there to start to learn about, you know, whose land you walk on, what is some current issues that people are needing to be addressed. What can you do? What can you do if that is just to think of yourself, of putting yourself in someone else's shoes of what had happened, even if you don't want to hear it. I think there's just a lot out there and so many different scholars. I'll plug the California Indian Studies and Scholars Association, who is newly formed and really pushing the boundaries of what we will see in terms of when we talk about California Indians in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really good insight from all of you. We are coming to our time and want to be conscious of everybody's time. So I really appreciate the three of you taking your time. And again, also just taking the time to share your knowledge with folks. I think that these are really, well, history is very dense. It's really important that people, especially in California, but across the country, start to understand how these things that are sort of dry, like people don't usually jump to learn about treaties and, you know, the dates that they happen, but how that really needs to be visibilized so that we can see how to move forward in a way that gives justice to Indigenous peoples and the history that has not been giving justice to Indigenous people. So I appreciate it. I appreciate the work that you're all doing currently. And yes, thank you very much. We had one last question that I think it's too big of a question to dive into, but I think I want to pose it to the participants as a way to start thinking about preparing for our next session. We hope all of you will join us, and I will chat it in the chat. But the question is, to build on this question that we were just discussing, about how UC education can, sorry, I can't chat. And so to build on the question about how UC education can properly integrate the history and contemporary reality of Native American dispossession, I'm wondering how this might work for a wide range of disciplines, especially STEM, such as chemistry, math, and biology. Obviously, all this education is happening at the UC and benefiting from the history of UC land grabs, but it's not so obvious for these disciplines. What needs to happen? And I think that's an excellent question to sort of put us into the next phase. And today we laid out a lot of history, a lot of dates, a lot of numbers that is really useful and really valuable. And it takes a deep dive to kind of understand the impact that it has had. I think less for Native people and Native Californians who live it and have been living for decades and not decades, generations with that, with the results of and the impacts of these actions, both by the government and by different institutions as they have acquired things as resources without paying attention to the impact that it would have on actual people. But I think it's also important that we focus on something that both Kat and Brittany outlined, is that this also speaks to the incredible resilience of Native people and Indigenous people in this country, but also in the state. So, and the fact that now Kat, what you just brought up is exactly sort of how I was going to end, is we are in a moment of opportunity, because they're outside of this moment of social justice where that the country is facing, and sort of grappling with our history as a nation. It's uncomfortable, but there is also moments for opportunity and moments for change and pivot. I think we're also at this place where there are so many California Native scholars who are coming up and who are able to take this moment and move it forward in a way that we haven't had the opportunity before. So I just want to recognize that and say, we hope that all this information informs our participants to move into our next forum, which will be held October 25th. From 9 to 12:30, and it moves more into the practice. So what are UCs actually doing right now? And specifically, we're focusing on the campuses that are land-grant institutions that received funding. And so we will have a panel of partners who are working with different UCs in a variety of ways and talking about what they're doing as a way to inform ideas and spur conversation with what we can do better and how we can push our universities to do more. So that will be a great conversation. We hope that you will join us. And if you want to register for part 2, it is in the chat. I think we're going to, I want to take, before we end today, I wanted to take a moment to just really thank some of our invisible partners who've been really working behind the scenes to help us. And we've had staff from the Hearst helping. Katie has done a great job with all of this chat management. Louisa and Max, Louisa is the assistant director for NASD, and Max works at the Myers Center. They've been handling the questions and helping me sort them. And Deborah Lustig from the Joseph Myers Center has been really instrumental in making this all run smoothly. So we're all gonna turn our cameras on, and I just wanna take a moment before we close to let people get recognized. So you can see the folks behind the scenes. Yay, thank you all. So now we're gonna turn it over for a closing to a graduate student in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department at TSS Butch.
Thanks, Fenosha. And again, I just want to lift all of you up, Fenosha and Rosalie, Deborah, I know you all have been working so hard to make this event happen. And as a Native student here at UC Berkeley, it feels amazing to be a part of this conversation, and it's so important. And the work that everyone has done here today is really powerful, and it's inspiring to see. And I feel really moved, to action. So I'm excited for part 2. And I also want to thank everyone who's attended today. You're taking this step, and we're all starting on this journey of trying to figure out what do we do next? What is the next step? What can we do today to justify and or bring justice to all those that have been hurt and have felt the pain and the physical and financial and spiritual weight of the expropriation of their lands. So I want to thank, our presenters, Tristan and Robert, for your groundbreaking work, all of the detail-oriented mapping and tracing that you have done in this article. I think it's amazing work. So definitely in huge gratitude to both of you for starting this conversation. And again, you know, for Rosalie for picking this up and trying to incorporate this in your work. I think you are an amazing example of what allies can do and putting action to these things. And I know you just work tirelessly on that. So I just want to acknowledge you, and I want to hold you up in this space. And also Fenosha is such a tireless worker on all Native and Indigenous issues on campus. And so I want to lift her up, and I'm in deep gratitude for everything that you have done. And I want to end today with a prayer. So I'm going to light some sweetgrass that we use in my tribe, the Northern Ute. And I want to say, Grandfather, Toweakos, Muwaram, Toweakos, Porque Samahi Chishige, Muwanam, Porque all these people. Thank you, Grandfather, for this event. Thank you for each of these panelists, Grandfather. We're here with all the spirits of those that have been affected by this land expropriation. And we pray for their hearts and we pray for their minds, Grandfather, both the past and the present, that you can be with them, that you can hold them, Grandfather, and give them the strength that they may need. And we set an intention to work on these issues within our universities, within our own lives, within our daily practices, Grandfather. Ask for your help, we ask for your strength, we ask for your guidance to work on these issues in a good way and with good hearts. Ask for good blessings, Grandfather, for all those that have joined us today, that you be with them and that this momentum carry forward with all of us to accomplish what we need to in a good way. Thank you for all you've done for us. Toeachos, all my relations. And we're a little early, but I think that's okay to end. But thank you all so much for coming and participating today. Please come to the next event. Let's make some change. We can envision a new future, and I think we should think really radically about that. I'd like to see free tuition for every Native student. I'd like to see all of the land given back. I think that these are things that can happen. And at the very least, it's something we can work towards. So thanks again to all our presenters and all of our participants. I hope you have a good weekend and join us again in a month.